Hi, my name is Ben Stubbs, and this is a presentation for my group's Project 3. Our presentation is over warfare, drones, and cyber warfare. In this group with me is Kendra Schroeder, Ashley Abiad, Chengyi Yen, Jordan Rosales, Max Beach, Stephanie Sadana, Sydney Demechko, Kat Benny, and Max Zun. So what is the issue and what is currently happening? The issue is that warfare is transitioning to being fought behind computer screens. And one example of that is the use of unmanned drones that will survey and then potentially engage enemy combatants. And these drones can vary from a aircraft that flies over the enemy to an automatic ship on the sea, to an automatic submarine in the water, surveying for mines, as well as unmanned ground vehicles that will drive around and potentially engage combatants or move casualties away from a war front. So what this kind of does is that this can remove soldiers from harm's way, and that has some upsides and downsides. One of the upsides is that soldiers are now fighting battles while thousands of miles away. And what that can kind of mean is that these soldiers are going to be completely out of harm's way. They could be in their home country even, and they will never have to feel the danger of their life being on the line. The bad side of that is that this could help the weight of pulling the trigger to lessen. And what I mean by that is, that fact that if you are going to shoot someone potentially, as of now, you had to look at the other person on the other side of the gun barrel. Well, what this can do is this can put them as pixels on a computer screen, and it may not carry the same emotional baggage. Though other cases have shown that there are high cases of PTSD from drone operators, because usually they have been surveying their targets and their target surroundings for a while, and have grown attached potentially to the civilians that are surrounded by their targets. And their drone strikes, if they cause casualties or military casualties, can really cause some PTSD in these drone operators. Another issue is that countries are trying to rise the autonomous systems in drones, and these systems may not be able to differentiate between friends or foe. And either way, they will still not hesitate to pull the trigger, as that their coding is just told them that any targets, they should pull the trigger. One of the other issues of warfare transitioning behind computer screens is cyber warfare. Cyber warfare is used to disrupt an enemy state digitally. And one of the issues with cyber warfare changes the way the war will be fought in a few different ways, because of the fact that the strength of fighting force has no effect on cyber warfare. If we have, 1 million soldiers versus another country's 100,000, if they have a better computer system and stuff like that than us, they could potentially cripple different infrastructure networks in our country ourselves. And instead of fighting battles on ground, these cyber attacks can cause 7 different types of issues, anywhere from espionage to sabotage of different systems, denial of service attacks or DDoSes, to disrupting infrastructure networks like electrical power grids or fuel systems. They could send propaganda attacks, like some of the things that have happened in recent elections. There could be an economic disruption because a lot of the economies are now virtual, as well as they could cause issues to first warning systems that could then allow for surprise attacks to happen. And one of the most recent examples of cyber warfare taking place has happened between the conflict of Iran and Israel, where Iran's fuel distribution system was shut down for 12 days after a cyber attack. So this not only affected the military complex, but as well as the civilians in the country, because they were not able to access fuel for 12 days. So I will pass this on to the next part of our presentation. Thank you.
Technology has always played a large role in warfare. In recent years, there has been development of drones, which are able to do things like surveillance, weapon delivery, and also drone strikes, among many other things. Drone strikes, though, are at the center of attention when it comes to unmanned vessels during wartime. These drones are able to hover over and run surveillance on people below without them knowing, which brings into question civilian privacy. The military also uses these drones for drone strikes. Many people have issues with drone strikes since there are often unintended civilian casualties. Drones are constantly being improved and are constantly being considered for new uses. There are, though, regulations for civilian use of drones, but not for military use. Cyber warfare is becoming increasingly common. With an increased amount of technology, there is an increase in the amount of things that can be affected by cyber attacks. The military can use technology to do things like attack an enemy's power grid, introduce propaganda, and steal enemies' secrets, and more.
Next, let's dive into some relevant statistics with military drones. The first statistic we'll be looking at is drone production. As you see, as of 2020, the global market share, 85% of it is towards the production and buying remotely operated drones. This is as opposed to semi-autonomous or fully autonomous drones. And specifically for the US, over the next 10 years, the US is forecasted to buy more than 1,000 combat drones. And by 2028, the US is forecasted to acquire more lightweight surveillance drones, around 43,000. And for both these categories, combat drones and surveillance drones, the US is projected to have more than the entire world combined. Another statistic we'll be looking at is just the market growth of military drones in general. On the left, we see one just for North America. This data was collected and interpolated in 2020, where the market for military drones is around 3.86 billion USD, and by 2028, it is projected to be almost, if not more than double that than what it is now. And this trend of military drone market growing is not just something contained in North America, but also globally. As you see on the statistics on the right, as interpolated back in 2018, all these different regions, Pacific Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, they're all jumping on this trend to acquire and develop more drone technologies. So this warfare technology is becoming more global. Another relevant statistic is just the usage of drones. In data collected from Reuters and compiled in this article, as shown below, there's a growing trend in the U.S. military to rely more on unmanned aircraft. This was written in 2016, and the article is quoted to say strikes by unmanned aircraft accounted for 56% of weapons deployed by the Air Force in Afghanistan in 2015, up dramatically from only 5% in 2011. Some statistics that might be relevant is just the preciseness of drone strikes. In the same article, is quoted to say that since Obama entered office, 642 drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia have killed an estimated 289 civilians, or 1 civilian per 1.6 strikes. So just shedding light on the effectiveness of drone strikes themselves. And this is just specific data of U.S. drone strikes in Afghanistan as collected by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And as you see, U.S. has implemented a lot of drone strikes, with the minimum confirmed strike number being around 13,000, with an estimated of 4,000 to 10,000 total killed, estimated 300 to 900 civilians killed, with around 66 to 184 civilians killed. And on the right, you see this timeline of all the strikes, of the number and when they happened. And you can just see this trend of the US utilizing more and more airstrikes from these unmanned drones as time goes on. Here are the same statistics, but for US drone strikes in Pakistan, in Yemen, and in Somalia. So why is this a broad topic of interest? Because using drones is a new form of warfare, and with this new form presents uncharted ground and unique issues. And of course, this has also happened with all new sorts of warfare in the past as well. And of course, the purpose of this presentation is to discuss the ethics of killing remotely and using these drone technologies. as of right now, there's not many established rules of engagement just because of how new this technology is. And there's also questions with the ethics of how humane this type of warfare is, especially with statistics showing that these drone strikes aren't the most precise. And if there are any ethical restrictions to be placed on these technologies, what would they be and by who? Would they be by governments or would it be by international bodies or different nations coming together and coming to an agreement of how these technologies can and cannot be used? And for these governments and the US specifically, how transparent should these bodies be with their use and with the statistics that they report to the citizens? For example, one of the articles I was reading while researching these statistics shared how it was more difficult to find more and more recent data of the casualties caused by drone airstrikes because several presidents have put into law and signed executive orders to not release that sort of information to the public. And as the statistics shows, there are more and more countries and nations and players joining in developing and buying this technology. The global market for military drones is only increasing, and it's not projected to die down anytime soon. So ethics is really going to matter if this type of warfare is going to be commonplace for the next era of war. So these issues and discussions need to happen because this technology is not going to go away. And for engineers specifically, because they're the ones who design, manufacture, and build these drone technologies, ethical questions could come up relating to how active of a role should the individual engineer play when dealing with the ethics of the technologies they're making. Should their role be more so as part of the industry, supporting innovation and supporting the governments and the clients that they are contracted out to? Or should the engineers bear more responsibility for the products and the technologies they're developing? And for US engineers specifically, because it is US companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all these other different plethora of defense industry companies that the government contracts out, because most of the drone technology innovators in the world are brought through US companies like these. It is important for US engineers to really think about the ethics of what they're developing and what their technology is being used for. So these are just an overview of why using drones, remote drones, as a new form of warfare is a topic of broad interest ethically.
All right, I'm Max. I'll be covering the ethical issues of drone warfare and cyber attack warfare. The main issue found with drone warfare is whether or not it is considered morally acceptable to design or use autonomous drones that can be used as weapons with the goal of harming or killing people. Some additional issues that are posed by drones are the lack of privacy given to civilians. Drones would initially be used for surveillance to watch everyone in a certain area to determine whether or not that they are a threat or whether they're just a simple citizen. This could be considered a violation of personal privacy because every single movement, every single decision, every single choice that someone makes is being observed and analyzed by people thousands of miles away. Another issue is found with the just war theory. There are two principles that are directly in conflict with this. The principle of necessity, where the target needs to have military value, and the principle of discrimination, where there's strong reason to believe that this target is not a civilian. There have been cases of drone strikes killing or hurting civilians that are not terrorists in Iran. This means that while they may have been in an area with a terrorist, they were not necessarily a target, and there was not enough reason to believe that they were a target, violating both the discrimination policy, the principle, and the necessity principle. As for cyber warfare, the issue with that is that cyber attacks will unintentionally harm civilians, making it difficult for them to recover from any attack or from any damages that could be unintentionally affecting them. Cyber attacks also go into looking at government secrets or country secrets, which could unintentionally leak information about the citizens to other countries and other governments for them to use. As for why these are ethical issues, drones and drone strikes have been found to be unsafe towards non-combatants. It has been stated that if they are used effectively, drones can minimize civilian casualties, and that is true. There have been cases where there have been very minimal civilian casualties. However, the big contradiction with this is that many governments, like the UK and the American government, state that there have been very, very few civilian deaths. However, journalists in the area, for example, Iranian journalists, they report that there have been thousands of civilian deaths as a result of these drone strikes, showing a contradiction between the two sources as to who we should trust, the government stating that there's only a few civilian deaths, or people from that area stating that there have been actually thousands. Another reason why this could be drone strikes could be an ethical issue are that it causes PTSD to the drone operators. A good example of this would be the letter to Judge O'Grady that we read in class, where the author of the letter stated that while he was sitting comfortably behind the computer, just pressing a button and killing people, it started to weigh on him what he was doing, and the guilt got to him, causing PTSD. However, these technology has shown that it keeps pilots, drone operators, or any military members safer and out of the actual battle zone, which is very beneficial. A lot of deaths would be caused on the battlefield between two military oppositions, whereas drones or cyber attacks could keep them safe within our own borders. Another reason why there are ethical issues is cyber attacks are very strong and very fast attacks. It's very difficult to stop once it happens. However, they lack a lot of directness. Any attack on a government's infrastructure or network online could unintentionally spread towards its civilians and harm them instead, making it very difficult for them to recover or repair any technology that was damaged, because they would have to find every single device that was attacked. As for engineers, it poses the question of whether or not it's the design of the products or the use of the products that is causing these ethical issues. The NSPE Code of Ethics states that engineers are supposed to uphold the safety of humanity. So is this a violation of, is it considered a violation of that code when engineers are developing these drones or developing software to produce cyber attacks? Is it considered a violation of that principle or that section if these are being used to unintentionally kill people or unintentionally harm their online presence? This poses another question of whether or not the engineers should continue to develop drones to be used in warfare, as well as should any computer engineer continue to develop the software that is used in the cyber attacks.
I'm Jordan Rosales, and I will be discussing the values at stake when it comes to evaluating the ethical considerations of warfare and warfare technology like drones and cyber warfare. As Max just discussed, this topic is an ethical issue, which means that there are many different sets of values working with and against each other in the engineering and development of warfare technology, as well as in the use of different warfare technology by militaries. I'm first going to discuss the values listed on the left as being concerned with warfare engineering that are in favor of the development and new warfare technologies. These values outline a desire to act in interest in protecting an overall greater good. The first value that motivates the development of new warfare technologies is the sense of responsibility that the military and engineers feel to develop new technologies that protect the welfare of the public and the safety of the military. Authority is another value that a country or government may feel over the actions of other countries and in maintaining order on a global scale. This value emphasizes the importance in acting to most effectively protect the greater good and in protecting innocent people from the actions of groups that are deemed dangerous or unjust. This would also indicate for new technology, the need for new technologies like cyber warfare and drone strikes to be able to exercise this authority. Another value that works in favor of warfare technology is justice, which in this context is associated with ensuring that countries are behaving fairly and that equity is maintained on a global level. This may require technologies that are able to deliver swift and effective attacks to prevent the motion of further attacks from terrorist groups via drone strikes or cyber warfare sabotage. As you can see, there are two values that are highlighted in red for their roles in both promoting warfare engineering as well as being at stake due to the use of warfare engineering. The first value, which holds this complicated relationship, is the feeling of patriotism experienced by people within a side of the war. Patriotism is the feeling of pride and importance in one's country. This feeling would motivate the military to ensure that they have the most up-to-date and advanced technologies. This would also motivate people to ensure that their government seeks revenge for any acts against the country or citizens of the country exercised by other groups of people. Another value that plays a complicated role in development of warfare technology is peace. While the uses of warfare technologies may not be inherently peaceful, the intention of using these methods is to ensure that a broader sense and level of peace is maintained, and by preventing larger scale attacks and future devastation. I'm now going to discuss the values listed on the right side of the slide as being at stake during warfare and using new warfare technologies. These values are concerned with the violence associated with utilizing advanced engineering technology during warfare. The first value placed at stake is humanity, which is the sense of value for human life and in acting in ways that exemplify the quality or condition of being human, such as benevolence and kindness and love. The acts of violence between the different groups of the human race can threaten humanity and the perceived value of human life, as many lives are destroyed by war and the different actions that take place in war. One example of this discussed in class is the desensitization of drone operators to human death, as they have a front seat in each execution. This value also relates to the next value at stake, which is compassion for people on opposing sides. Compassion and forgiveness is often virtually non-existent in the eyes and the policies of war, and rarely are attacks executed without equal and opposite attacks of retaliation. War is often said to take a smaller disagreement or a smaller scale or subset of each population and maximize it to wars between countries that can affect millions of people worldwide. This effectively destroys each population's compassion for one another. Trustworthiness is another value at stake using these new wartime technologies. Trust is lost among people on the same side of a war when citizens put trust in their government and military to behave in a certain way, and then the government does not uphold these expectations. Many Americans are against the drone strikes and have lost complete trust in the US government to act in ways that they deem as ethical during a time of war. The invasive surveillance techniques that these new technologies have introduced is also reason for many to distrust their own government and their government's surveillance policies. Trust is also lost between people of opposite sides of war, of course, when the militaries and government enact attacks and carry out extensive surveillance operations against them. Now I'm going to discuss the reason that patriotism and peace are also at stake when discussing warfare technology. Patriotism is threatened by the opposing views and values of people among one another on one side of the war. People lose a sense of patriotism and respect for their countries when they disagree with the actions and policies of their own country during war, causing them to not identify with that side anymore. Another value that is threatened in this discussion is peace. While the motivations of many wartime decisions and actions may be to achieve an overall higher level of peace, the resentment felt by victims of such attacks often does not fade over time and can result in future conflicts. Many innocent people are harmed by attacks intended to maintain peace, such as civilians unintentionally harmed in the US drone strikes that have occurred in the past 10 years. This has created exponentially more hostility between the US and the Middle East, even though the intent was to target people who were considered a threat to world peace. The values at stake in the development of warfare technology exemplify the internal conflict faced by engineers in their duty to hold paramount the safety and welfare of the public, but also producing and developing technologies with the power to seriously harm or kill large populations of people.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about the papers, some of the papers that we read in class and what the authors are arguing. So in the first paper called Drone Warfare by Sabo and Doyle, the author supports drone usage in warfare. This includes autonomous drones, manned drones, and a mix of both. He highlights the ways that drones are being made to be safer, including navigation, spying, and even casualty evacuations. He tries to focus on the benefits of drones and even talks about the negative connotation that surrounds autonomous machines. So Doyle's trying to get rid of that negative connotation, but I do think it's interesting that he does talk about it. I think it does help his argument a bit. And in the second paper that I'm going to evaluate is Letter to Judge O'Grady by Daniel Hale. And in this one, Hale talks about his personal experience with drone warfare and the firsthand trauma he experienced from it all. And he included this all in a letter to Judge O'Grady, pretty much saying how he doesn't think drones should be used in warfare. He explains specific traumatizing events that he experienced with drones causing more damage than good. Multiple of these experiences that he talked about included the killing of innocent people. And the third paper that I'm going to evaluate is called As Engineers, We Must Consider the Ethical Implications of Our Work. And this is by Abbas El-Zain. In it, he focuses on the ramifications of innovation and how engineers need to be more mindful of what they are creating. He wants to create a higher standard for engineers since most focus on the design of their product, not necessarily on the ethics of what their product will be used for. For drones and warfare specifically, engineers are creating technology that could be used to kill other people. So he specifically thinks that engineers should be thinking more ethically, especially when it comes to such big topics such as this. And in the last paper that I'm going to be evaluating, it's called The Philosopher Making the Normal Case for US Drones. And this is by Bradley Strasser. In it, Strasser supports the use of drones in warfare since it's saving money, increasing capability, and even protecting warfighters. He thoroughly addresses the counter-arguments of his ideas, but he cares the most about whether or not the operation or the attack is justified. Pretty much all the articles, even though I only talked about 4, all of them either fully support or do not support the use of drones in warfare. For these 4 specifically, Doyle and Strasser support the usage, whereas Hale and Elzine don't. However, Doyle and Strasser's views are similar in that they believe the technology can be very helpful to the US and they focus on the benefits. Strasser focuses a bit more on the ethical side, same with Elzine, but Doyle is very specific about what drones can be used for other than just killing people. Hale focuses on his firsthand experiences of drones and how he doesn't think that they should be used since he has seen them in action and he thinks that they will cause more harm than good. And like I said before, Elzine focuses on the ethical reasons, but not just of drones, but he's more focused on the ethics of the engineers who create such technology. But overall, most of the papers and the authors that we've read have very differing arguments and opinions, but it's really interesting to see what they talk about. Most of them talk about their own firsthand experience and their own background, I think, to help their argument, but it is very interesting.
Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'm going to be talking about utilitarianism. We've talked about it a bit in our class, and we know that the core principle is the greatest happiness principle. And we also know that there are 4 characteristics to classical utilitarianism. And the first tenet of this would be consequentialism, that the consequences of an action matter. And in this case, the act of creating the drone has no consequences itself. The consequences come in when you use those drones for specific purposes. And in this case, since they're being used for warfare, they create like negative consequence of people's lives being claimed in these massive airstrikes, even if they weren't the original targets. But the positive consequences, I guess, would be the ease of use for, you know, those who designed it and for those who were to use it. Maximalism is the second tenet, and it states that the right action produces the maximum amount of pleasure and least amount of displeasure. And I think in this case that drones would not be used for killing. Other methods would be preferred because of the disproportion of the amount of people who are killed versus the people who were targeted. Going along with this is the third tenet of classical utilitarianism, and this is the aggregate pleasure and displeasure. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's both positives and downsides to using drones as for warfare. And depending on what side you're on, it seems that more negative or displeasure is created. However, in the last tenet of classical utilitarianism, we need to consider both sides. So the military's perspective, as well as the citizens, says that both of these viewpoints are valid. Now, while looking at act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, these state to conduct the action in which the right moral thing is to do. And I think that these would essentially say that using drones for warfare would be unethical. And this is because the right thing to do doesn't depend on our interests. It depends on the consequences of the actions and what causes the most harm than good.
Hi, my name is Ashley Appian, and I will be discussing the issue of drones and cyber warfare in a view of Kantianism. So just to refresh, Kantianism is about a person's motive, not the consequences of their actions. This whole idea focuses on the right action. So Kant believed in the idea of duty, which is an obligation to do the right thing. So when I was evaluating the idea of duty, I thought of people serving our country in the military and engineers. So men and women in the military have a duty to serve the United States. However, the engineers that are creating these drones and other military weapons have a duty to follow the engineering code of ethics, which requires them to ensure the health and safety of the public. However, I think that they don't follow the engineering code of ethics when they are creating drones and other weapons that are used to potentially kill civilians. So then, following that, I thought about acting for the sake of duty, which is the only way of action that Kant believed has any moral worth. So in order for people in the military that are using drones in order for them to act for the sake of duty, they have to recognize and believe that using drones and other military weapons is the right way to solve national and international issues. So one thing I like to point out here is, first of all, not all people in the military are going to be able to agree with this statement. So I feel like that falls in the category for them not to be acting for the sake of duty. And that can be seen in the Hale letter to the judge, because he didn't like what he was doing. And then engineers, they would have to recognize that they are creating weapons that could potentially kill civilians, and that this is the right way to demonstrate their trade. However, in another source that we read this week, some of these engineers, actually none of these engineers, when they are hired by the Pentagon, really know what these drones are specifically going to be used for. They don't know who they are targeting. So how could they be acting for the sake of duty? And then I think an important thing is, are these groups' actions performed because of the goodwill? I don't think so. Maybe some people in the military believe that. However, using drones prevents them from getting hurt. They get to hide behind a computer screen. And Hale's letter, discussed that some of these military personnel, they thought it was like a video game. So I don't necessarily think that these people are acting for the sake of duty and acting in a way of displaying goodwill. So continuing this conversation, I would like to talk about a maxim, which is a principle according to which one sees oneself as acting. So for people to be using these drones and creating these drones, it'd be men and women in the military using drones and engineers behind the creation of drones are fulfilling a patriotic duty. So to analyze this, like I mentioned earlier, people in the military, if they feel like they're fulfilling a patriotic duty, can we still consider hiding behind a computer and a controller, targeting people? That sometimes doesn't work, also shown in Hale's letter to the judge, that are they really fulfilling a patriotic duty? I think that's something to consider. And then engineers, if they are not part of the military, if they're not engineers in the Army or engineers that are part of the Navy, do they have a duty to fulfill a patriotic duty, or is their duty to our nation and the globe as a whole to ensure health and safety, which states in the engineering code of ethics? So going into that, Kant had a thing called the categorical imperative. And the one message that stood out to me the most, I think that applies to drones and cyber warfare, is never treat someone as a means to an end. So does the military do this when they kill potential enemies in addition to civilians? Are their deaths mean to an end for a political issue? I think yes, they do treat these people as a means to an end. They really believe that, okay, we're going to target this enemy. However, most likely it will relate in civilian deaths, but it will end this issue. That's basically what we thought in the war on terrorism. So yeah, I think that's an important thing to consider. So overall, I feel like people that follow cons theories would not approve of cyber warfare and drones because these people are not acting in a way of goodwill. They are not acting for the sake of duty, and they aren't following the categorical imperative. They do treat people as a means to an end.
All right, so I had virtue ethics, which focuses on the act of the like who is committing the act or who is okaying something to be done rather than the act itself to decide whether or not it is ethical. So there's a more loose guideline. So for something like drone warfare, it would focus on the people like the engineers who made the drones, who built them and designed them to be used as they are, the people who contracted them to make them knowing what they're going to be used for, and the people who would okay the use of them. So for these like three groups, some virtues that they would need to be, I guess, considered virtuous people would be, one would be honesty. So for the engineers, as being honest with themselves about what they're going to be used, what the drones and are going to be used for, how they could affect people, just kind of understanding that, not just looking past that. For the contractors, being honest with the people they're being told to make them, or they're telling to make them, being honest what they're going to be used for, how they're going to be used, how they could affect people. It's pretty much the same thing as the engineers. And for the people that are going to be okay for them, just being able to kind of be honest about the difference between something like a drone strike or just doing something for surveillance. You'd also need something, or compassion would be another virtue, being able to think about who's going to be affected by your actions, who's going to be hurt or who's going to benefit. So like the engineers would have to think about one, who could benefit, and then mainly who they are going to, I guess, who they could possibly hurt or who will possibly get hurt because of their actions and their own creations. Same with the people who okay the use, they need to be able to, I guess, understand the difference between using it as surveillance or an attack, being able to focus on the other people that they're, or the people that they could be possibly hurting or like changing their lives and hurting. They need to be able to be compassionate towards them and understand the issues that they're going through and things like that, and the issues that they themselves would be causing for those people. A vice could be greed, only doing it for the money. So the engineers could be only making it, they don't care about who it's going to affect, who it could possibly hurt. They only want it for the money. That would make the act unethical, as they only want it to benefit themselves. They don't care about what it would do to others, and they don't think about what it would do to others. Kind of a similar spot for who would okay it, who would commission something like that to be built. If they're just doing it for their own benefit or to get an edge, I guess, in something like warfare, it would not be a very ethical act, as they are only doing it for bad reasons. And so here it's pretty much, as long as the person who is using the drones, or it's like okaying them to be used as a virtuous person and they're seen as a good person, then the act would be deemed as ethical. Now, similar to what I said before, right there, the same would be true for someone who is seen as an unethical and bad person. Their decision would be viewed as bad for the same reasons that the good person's decision would be viewed as good, as they themselves are unethical. They would be doing it for poor reasons and would be cause the act to be unethical. So, in conclusion, warfare and drones and the use of them is an ethical issue because it will affect many people. It requires the thoughts. You have to think about a lot of possible situations. You have to think about a lot of things that could go wrong, a lot of people, how you could affect people, whether or not you would use it as like an attack or if it would just be surveillance and just trying to watch over an area and being able to tell you the difference between that would be ethical. And understanding the difference is what makes it an ethical issue and how it would affect people, how it would affect anyone that would be, I guess, affected by the choice to use drones as either an attack or surveillance. And then here's a source that was used in this presentation. And that is all.